Welcome to California Highways Route by Route. This podcast explores everything about numbered highways in California, from Route 1 along the coast to US 395 along the Sierras, from Route 8 in the south to Route 139 in the north.
Brought to you by California Highways webpage and Gribble Nation.
I'm Daniel Fagan. I do the California Highways webpage at cahighways.org.
I'm Tom Fear. I'm one of 4 admins on Gribble Nation. I'm the one you're usually seeing posted about California and the West Coast.
This is episode 1.03, Building a State Highway System, the 1930s and the War Years.
Last time on California Highways Route by Route, we saw the adolescent years of the California highway system as it was growing and finding itself. We saw the funding sources move from burst of bond issues authorizing construction to a gas tax-based system covering construction and maintenance. We saw the Good Roads movement emerge, and with it, a push for highway systems. We saw the federal aid highway system mature as well, with increasing federal matching funding for major state highways. We saw the start of the U.S. highway system with familiar black and white shields. With that, we saw the first highways being numbered in California. We saw the state define an increasing number of routes, almost all which were still significant routes today. Route numbers were maintained by the Division of Highways, but were not signed.
In this episode, we're going to continue that journey, looking at the changes in the 30s and the mid-1940s. During this time, state highways were authorized in urban areas. There were over 6,700 miles of roads added in 1933 alone. We saw the creation of the legislative route system and the state highway code. We saw signage of state highways starting. We saw continued adjustments and extensions of highways. We saw passage of the Freeway Act. We saw the Defense Highway Act in 1941, and then things slowed down with World War II, with really slow growth of this system through 1945. This episode will also feature an interview with Morgan Yates, the archivist of the Auto Club of Southern California.
As we entered 1933, the Division of Highways was managed within 10 districts, a large number of state highways, but there's basically an internal routing number, which really you wouldn't see outside of a Division of Highways or California Highway Commission source map.
About the only time I think you would see a number is if they had a construction sign up saying this is, a state highway route number blah, and that might have been the only time you would see it.
There's a fairly infamous photo about the East Farm Toll Road, which was Legislative Route or Route 127, which later became California State Route 190, where you can see one of those construction signs east of Darwin, which shows Route 127. That's one of the few I've actually seen photos of. Funding was a mix of a gas tax, remaining bond funds, and federal aid funding. The state could only construct and maintain highways between urban areas, but not in them. Major federal aid funding highways have U.S. route signage, but the system is not complete and still under construction at this point.
Big changes came in 1933. We saw the State Highway Classification Act of 1927 amended. As I said, 6,700 miles of county roads were added to the state highway system as secondary highways. The legislation specified the basic route. It went from point A to point B, but didn't assign numbers. And any references to other highways used the Division of Highway numbers, but there really wasn't a good list available to the general public. The highway construction funds at the time were allocated equally between the primary and the secondary highways.
Big change in 1933. The legislative barrier that prevented the state from maintaining urban mileage was removed. This was a huge deal. So before this act, you had a lot of highways that were really like U.S. routes signed through cities, but it was done at the local level. So this is why, if you ever research early U.S. routes in California, it's very, very difficult because it's really done whatever existing thoroughfare was available in a actual city. So Los Angeles, for example, when I did research on the early alignments of U.S. Route 66 in the city, it's all over the place. So if you have to look through the Los Angeles City Council minutes, it's not available really on any map, commercial or Division of Highways. This standardized everything where this is going to become more state standards moving as the 1930s go forward. District 11 was created in San Diego, so that brought the Division of Highways up to 11 districts.
And we should know, right now it's at 12 districts, so there's one more still to come.
With these 1933 changes, 202 state routes have been defining the bulk of the system present today, except for freeway routings.
1934 finally brought signage. It was announced in 1934 that state routes would be signed, and the signs would look like a miner's spade with a grizzly and a route number. It's interesting, and a lot of folks are interested, why do different states have different shaped signs, and a lot settle on circles or squares. Ours has that unique shield that when you look at it on the post, looks like someone took a shovel and stuck it in the ground, and this is why. It originally was white, and it had a grizzly bear on the top, and the route number in sort of a squarish block font that was almost like, very much like the U.S. Highway font. The signs at the time were posted by the California State Auto Association in the north and the Auto Club of Southern California in the south. And although the state would take over responsibility for signage in 1947, the Auto Clubs continued doing signage. The Auto Club of Southern California continued until 1956, and the California State Automobile Association in the north continued signage until 1969. There was, except for maybe one case, and that was, I think, an accident, no correspondence between the signed route numbers and the legislative route numbers.
That ended up being California State Route 127.
But I thought it was 58.
58 actually was mostly California State Route 178, US 466, and US 66. So the legislative route was actually adopted for much of that corridor post-1964, but it wasn't a one-for-one match because 58 as a state highway signed state route didn't exist until the renumbering, which we'll get into in another episode.
And some state sign routes were even applying to non-state-owned highways. It was just, in some cases, the Auto Club signed them, and that's how it worked. And we'll have a whole episode dealing with how state routes are numbered. It's one of the things that sort of, other than a love of maps, got me into the hobby of wondering, where did these numbers come from? Be forewarned, the way the state numbers highways is both logical and completely bizarre. Would you say that's fair, Tom?
Yeah, it was mostly grid-based clusters originally, and the original scheme fell apart very, very quickly as additions were made or duplications had to be eliminated.
And then the great renumbering totally changed everything. So.
Yes.
Now is the time in the podcast when we bring in a guest to talk about a subject related to this episode. Today's guest is Morgan Yates of the Auto Club of Southern California, who's going to talk about the Auto Club's role in signing state highways and its larger role in history and all that other fun stuff. Morgan, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Morgan Yates, and I'm the archivist for the Automobile Club of Southern California, based here in Los Angeles at the club's headquarters building at Adams and Figueroa.
Well, let me say, first of all, that it's great that the club still has an archivist. I know so many corporations are getting rid of archivists and keeping track of the history, and it's really important to keep.
Yes, I'm very thankful for that as well, and it all kind of got its start when the club was looking at turning 100 years old in the year 2000, and looking at that, they wanted to make sure that they could interpret their history. And in order to do that, you had to kind of have it in one place and organized and all of this. And so they created an archives where one didn't really exist before. Like a lot of old companies, the historical documents and just old stuff was spread all over the place and nobody was really paying attention to it. But the club recognized it as an asset and wanted to get it all organized. And so they hired a professional staff to do that, and we had a staff historian as well. And so we're very thankful that the club had the foresight to do that, and so here we are today.
Are the archives open to the public?
You know, we do host researchers from the public. We do it on a schedule on an appointment basis because there's just me, and that allows me to manage my time. But people who do have focused a legitimate research query, we invite them to contact us so that to see how we might be able to help them. We're not really set up like a library where you can kind of come in and rummage through things and poke around and so forth. And so it's a little different, but we are, generally speaking, open to the public. That's correct.
And trust me, I'll get past this digression to the real stuff in a second. How would they go about making that appointment?
You know, email and phone is the way to contact me. I can provide that information to you, Daniel, so that you can post it for folks that might be interested in reaching out.
Okay, we'll put it in the notes. And I want to note also that the Auto Club, if I remember correctly, has its archives online as well.
Only a very small portion is online. We're not part of any of these kind of larger archives databases like Calisphere and Online Archive of California. But we do have an arrangement with the University of Southern California, our neighbor just to the south of us. And many years ago, we loaned them some material to be digitized, scanned, and made part of a project they were doing that was creating kind of a virtual archive of Los Angeles. And so we have about 1,000 photographs from our photo collection and about 500 maps. The focus geographically is kind of on the greater Los Angeles area. And of course, the Auto Club's territory, it goes beyond that to the 13 counties of Southern California. So our holdings are broader than what you might find at the USC Special Collections Library online. But that's really our only online presence.
The one last question of this digression, when you set up the archives for the 100 years, as I recall, you published a book around that time. I think I've still got a copy of it on the history of the Auto Club and its role in things. Is that book still available anywhere?
You know, it is, I'm glad you mentioned that, Daniel. The title, and it did come out in the year 2000, our centennial year, the title is called The Road Ahead, and it's a history of the institution. At the time, the club did provide copies to libraries, but it wasn't ever available for purchase online or in, regular brick and mortar bookstores. So a lot of copies were printed and they did get out there, but I think they might be a little challenging to find these days. It's kind of a coffee table style book. The narrative is actually quite proud of it. I think it does a very good job to kind of tell that 100-year history of the Auto Club. And then, of course, it is chock full of imagery, everything from our photo collection, our map collection. We have an art collection as well, cover art for our member magazine. That was part of a cover art program that the club did for many years. And so those are all well represented in that book, The Road Ahead. But it's probably a little tricky to find. I suspect if somebody went onto eBay, for example, they may be able to find a copy.
Or use books on Amazon.
Perhaps, yes.
And with that, talking about the history, why don't we start the more focused part of this, which is, let's start with the early days of that history. On a previous episode, we had Adam Prince on talking about the Good Roads movement. What was the Auto Club's involvement with the Good Roads movement? Both, we should say we have two auto clubs in California. There's the Auto Club of Southern California, which Morgan is with, and which I've been a member of since I was a teenager, and the California State Automobile Association, which is the northern half of the state. So what was the Auto Club's involvement with the Good Roads movement?
Yeah, I can certainly cover that, and I can give you a real quick background on the kind of the nature of the two motor clubs in California. It's something that it can be confusing for folks who've moved north or south. But, in a way, the Good Roads movement plays a role in the creation of the Auto Club of Southern California. Many of your listeners probably are aware that the Good Roads movement got its start, I think, in the 1880s, and it was an effort on the part of that latest craze of transportation at that time, the bicyclists. And when you think about it, bicyclists were interested in good roads, that idea, that dream of really smooth pavement as a way to make bicycling that much easier and more enjoyable. And so they kind of took on the Good Roads moniker to represent that ideal. 20 years later or so, right around the turn of the 20th century, you start to see the automobile kind of make its way onto the landscape. And of course, that Good Roads idea was also very much on the minds of people who were just beginning to explore the use of these new automobiles. So it was a natural connection. Interestingly, the National Good Roads Convention was held in Los Angeles in the fall of 1900. And at that time, automobilists were also taking part in that Good Roads movement. And there were some demonstrations at Agricultural Park, which is located now where Exposition Park is. There was a racetrack there for horses and an oval track. There was a demonstration there of a vehicle that made the 1 mile oval run unimpeded by anything else, nothing else on the road they had to dodge. And they did that 1 mile run in about 2 minutes. So that's an average of about 30 miles an hour. And at that time, that was very impressive. So again, a public demonstration of things. And there were people who saw these demonstrations and were involved in the Good Roads movement that thought that this might be the time to kind of get together and create an organization that was dedicated to the automobile. 10 of these new motorists got together in a downtown law office in October of 1900 and said, let's create this organization. And so they filed the appropriate papers, and the papers went from the county up to the Secretary of State's office where corporation was logged. And on December 13th, 1900, the corporation papers were certified, and so we kind of marked that as our official birthday. And so that National Good Roads Convention in Los Angeles kind of pushed everything together to create the Auto Club of Southern California.
It also, as I recall, resulted in some recommendations to state government that led to them starting to create the state highway system.
As you know, the State Division of Highways was created in 1895. Just a few years later, I'm sure events like this becoming more popular, people starting to do things, I'm sure would have kind of triggered that kind of bureaucratic mechanism to start moving a little bit more quickly.
How did the Auto Club get involved with the actual signing of highways?
The Auto Club, when it got its start, those 10 original members, it was more of a social organization. As such, they organized runs on weekends and picnics and various other social events. But after a few years, the club wasn't really growing much. And so about 1905, they got the membership together in a room. There were probably about 55 of them altogether. So that made up the bulk of the membership. And they said, we need to rethink what we're doing here. So it was out of that meeting and subsequent meetings that the club decided to shift away from a social organization and adopt more of a service to members model. So this happens about 1905, 1906. So with that new shift, that new focus, the board of directors started casting about for things that they could do that would improve the lot of automobile owners, which, in 1905, it was not very many folks who had the wherewithal to own an automobile. It was a very expensive proposition back then. Really, the first thing that they came up with was, and saw the need for, was to improve the signage on the roads for motorists, because it was essentially non-existent. The county of Los Angeles, for example, 1904, started putting up these kind of stone markers, county markers, a few of which still exist. There's actually one, I've seen a few of them in place, but when you look at them, they look almost like headstones in a cemetery. They weren't very tall, they weren't very prominent, and the information that was chiseled onto them, unless you really knew what it was, it didn't have the kind of information that road signs have today at all. It was to have like Roman numerals that would designate the number of miles from downtown to wherever the stone marker was. Very limited in its ability to communicate information that was needed by people traveling along the road. So the club said, well, we can do better than this. And they started figuring out a design for signs that were geared more towards automobilists rather than, people driving in carriages pulled by horses at a much slower speed. And so as an experiment, the club signposted the route from downtown Los Angeles out to the beach cities, Santa Monica and Playa del Rey and so forth. And in order to do that, of course, you had to survey the route because the road system was really kind of chaotic. There was no rhyme or reason to it. And so the club put up the signs and they were an immediate hit. People said, yes, this is something that we can use. And the merchants and manufacturers out on the west side say, hey, this is great because people can find us. So it was a big hit and it was reported as such in the newspapers. And the club said, hey, we got something good going on because in addition to providing that information on the signage, each sign had a little stylized version of the club logo on it. So it was kind of free advertising. And so the club's presence was elevated by that. And people started thinking, well, what is this group?
These were mainly the directional signages. In other words, the ones that said Playa del Rey this direction or Playa del Rey 20-mile type thing.
Yeah, it was much later on that you see these other signs like warning signs and regulatory signs, speed limits and so forth.
Was the club putting up the warning and the regulatory signs as well?
Eventually, but I think at this very early stage, it really was essentially just the guide signs. So, 13 miles to Santa Monica with an arrow perhaps pointing in the direction. And a lot of times these signs would be posted where roads came together. So where there was a question about which direction to go, these signs would provide some guidance for that. So it was later on that you see these other categories of signs being posted. But early on, for the most part, it was the name of a place, an arrow, and how many miles you had to go to get there.
Who determined which route was chosen? If there were, let's say, multiple routes to Santa Monica, one along Santa Monica Boulevard, one along Wilshire, one along Olympic, who decided which was the recommended route?
Well, in this very early period, the very first signs, there weren't a lot of options. It was only later on that you had options. But the signposting folks, and there wasn't really an official department at this time. We didn't really have much in the way of permanent employees. It was the board of directors that were volunteering to do these early signposting efforts. They would modify their private vehicles to carry the posts, and we would find a vendor that would create the signs, and they were metal-covered enamel, which was quite durable as long as you didn't shoot a bullet through it, which happened quite a bit later on. They were very serviceable in that respect.
Signs have lasted to this day. So.
In some cases, yes, though they're increasingly rare. There are people who collect the old auto club signs, and so I've occasionally been alerted club signs that were still on the road, but I was always loath to try to kind of keep that information to myself because oftentimes they would disappear.
I'll say our co-host has a fair number that he's collected over the years in his garage.
Yes, and I've interacted with sign collectors over the years, and we have a small number of them in our corporate archives, though we're not in the habit of collecting them because they're quite expensive these days.
As the state started to allocate the highway route and construct state highways, did the Auto Club shift a preference for signing roads to those better maintained state highways?
I don't know if shift is the right way to put it, but they certainly included them or added them to the projects, the signposting efforts that the club undertook. I would imagine that if there was folks that were prioritizing which routes would get signed, it would be where the demand was greatest. And so the main road between towns, things like that, were going to receive more attention. And then down the list a little bit would be signs within municipalities.
How long did the club keep signing highways? I read somewhere, I think it was Southern California was until 56 and Northern California was 69.
Well, the two motor clubs, ourselves and then our sister club up north, we started signing roads about 1906 or so. And then it wasn't really until just after World War II that the state Division of Highways took over the signage of freeways. And so we phased out of that. And then from 1946 until about 1956, 10 years or so, it was more of a gradual phase out with club signposting efforts with various local jurisdictions.
Where was the dividing line between the two clubs?
So the Northern Club, well, it's almost easier to describe the Southern Club's service region. It's the 13 counties of Southern California, so from the Mexican border, Arizona border, north up through Inyo and Tulare County, Santa Barbara County, San Luis Obispo County, kind of working our way up north. And so it's those 13 counties of Southern California. And then California State Automobile Association had the remaining part of the state. That territorial dividing line was pretty static. It was decided pretty early on, and there was a little bit of back and forth when it came to Southern Nevada and the Las Vegas area early on. The Auto Club of Southern California had that as part of its territory, but then in the mid-50s it kind of shifted to the Northern Club. But for the most part, those two territories were set up pretty early and adhered to, and so we would signpost roads within our region, and California State Automobile Association had the rest of the state, and they were doing the same thing in their territory.
Route numbers for U.S. highways came in 1926, and I'm sure you weren't involved with that. And the route numbers for the state highways came in 1934 and 1935. Did the clubs have any influence on what numbers the state picked, or was that all a division of highway thing for the signage?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I don't think the club had any numerologists on its board that had a particular fondness for numbers that they wanted to apply to state routes. So it's my sense, Daniel, that the club really didn't play any formative role in the selection of the numbers when it came to that.
Once the state routes came in, did the club still do signing on the non-state maintained roadways? And were they signing route numbers on any non-state roads? Like, I know the source of this question is that US 66 was not officially designated a particular set of streets in the cities until a particular time. And was the club picking the route for US 66 at that time?
It's a good question, and I've not seen any information in our holdings, though I've not made an exhaustive search for it, that we would have played any role in that. I know that US 66 is a great example, and if you're traveling west, as it enters into San Bernardino and Los Angeles County, the route has been researched pretty carefully, what surface streets it was taking to get to its terminus point. But I don't think that the club played any role in selecting those routes.
Our co-host Tom looked into that really closely briefly. And Ash Sturgis does not say anything about the route in the cities, and I think he was curious, how did the particular routes within the cities come about and whether the club was involved? So that was the source behind that. How were things coordinated, or was there coordination between the northern and the southern parts of the state, especially when you were signing things that had to cross that county border between north and south?
Right, you want it to be seamless. And I would imagine that the signposting departments of the two respective clubs did occasionally, where the territories came together, they probably did have to reach out to their counterparts and say, this is our plan. How does that fit with what you guys are doing? I haven't seen any specific kind of relations or documentation of that, but I can tell you that the two motor clubs, we worked very closely together on a range of different things, most notably in advocating for reasonable traffic laws, motor laws, and so forth in Sacramento. So working with the state legislature, the two clubs coordinated quite a bit. We occasionally didn't see eye to eye when it came to streets and freeway funding, but for the most part, we were very closely aligned and worked in coordination with a lot of things. And so I have a feeling that that was the case in a lot of the other departments. And the two clubs, even though we were separate entities, a lot of the services and things that the respective members received from the two motor clubs was very similar. They developed things along the lines much at the same time. Emergency roadside service is probably the most prominent example of that. And maybe one of the clubs would start things a little bit earlier, but we were talking to each other. And so there was a lot of coordination. We knew what the other clubs were doing and often shared best practices and things like that. And so that included signposting, not just coordinating when the territories were coming together, but just how we went about doing it. It would have been very similar.
Were there any differences in signing practices? Were your signs the same style for advisory, warning, directional, or were there strongly distinct styles that you could tell, oh, I'm in the north now, other than the logo at the bottom?
Well, in Cal State, they had the logo on their signs as well. Their signs tended to be different colors. Ours were often white field with either blue or black lettering, and this had to do mostly with the guide signs. And then things like city limit signs, that whole range of things, of types of signs. The Northern Club had a kind of a color scheme that they used. But I think over time, as the signs became more standardized, as the state kind of stepped in and became more prominent in doing those kinds of things, that the state was the approving authority for sign design. And so the two motor clubs said, they saluted and said, yes, sir, that's what we'll do. And so it did kind of standardize over time. I have an example, a uniform sign chart from 1938 that our club prepared. And at the top, it says it's, approved by the Division of Highways, State of California. So while we had our logo on all those signs, it was the state that was responsible for their coming up with the design and coloring and lettering and so forth.
Was the state also paying you for the supplies and the cost of the signs?
That's a good question. I do know that and I think this was the case with both motor clubs, that there was this kind of cost-sharing arrangement, especially with local signs. You'd have a municipality or some local jurisdiction would reach out to us and say, hey, we'd like to have these signs put up. The club would say, sure, and the club would bear the cost for putting the signs in, and our signposting crews would actually go out and put them in. Oftentimes, the surveys would be done by the club, and we bore the cost for those, and then the local jurisdiction would actually pay for the production of the sign. So that was a cost-sharing thing. I do know...
The labor, they provided the material.
Exactly. And now, whether that was also the case with this when it came to the state, I don't know the answer to that. I know that counties and local jurisdictions, that was the arrangement, but I don't know how it was with the state.
We're focusing on this episode about the start of state signage. I read somewhere that the Division of Architecture designed the state sign route shield. Are you aware of the club submitting any proposals for that or having any input on the design concepts?
I suspect there's probably something in the archives. I just haven't tracked it down. But I do know that in our photo collection, we have some really kind of cool photos of these proposed signs that my understanding is that the club, our design folks, came up with some kind of varying designs for state routes that they proposed to the state of California for adoption. So we've got some photos of those, and some of them are kind of interesting shapes. Some of them are kind of the diamond or the four-sided signs, and then others have different shapes, and then they have different design elements on them, most of which featured the bear, the California bear. And so I always thought they were kind of interesting. I've never seen any actual signs that were, because these would have been prototypes, if you will, so they probably would have been made in a very small number.
Are you aware of whether that photo is accessible anywhere?
Of course, have them here in our photo collection, and probably, I don't know, a half dozen different design concepts. And these images date from 1929. Anyway, they're really kind of neat, and I always thought it might be fun to have a few of them made, reproduced with enamel covered metal, just to kind of have, because they do kind of show how these designs that we think of as very kind of industrial and just set, but they had to have been created at some point. And so this is showing that process, that proposal and contemplation and then design selection that obviously went into the signs that were adopted.
If you ever find that picture and you send it to us, we can certainly put it up on our websites that go along with this podcast and make it available to people so they can see it.
I think we might be able to do that.
That sounds great. As you mentioned, in 1946, 1947, the state took over signage responsibility. You said they did the freeways first. Auto Club kept signing until 56, the Northern Club until 69. What happened with that? How did that transition work? Do you know?
Well, I know how it played out internally, and the signposting effort the clubs really pioneered when they recognized that need that I talked about earlier was a service that the club was very proud of. We thought it really did a public service, really, even though it also kind of served an internal purpose of kind of raising the public visibility for the two motor clubs. But at the same time, our goal was to make lives of motorists better, and these signs, they did that, I think, pretty dramatically, pretty immediately. So when it ended by 1956, I think there was a sense of loss internally, but we shifted gears pretty quickly. I know that the signposting crews, and I don't know how many people we had in our signposting department, it would have been, not a huge number. A lot of them shifted to other departments, most notably our emergency roadside service, or the service patrol as it was called. And these people were used to being out on the road, sometimes for days at a time. We had pictures of some of our signposting crews in these cab-over signposting trucks, and their backs, where they had stored the signs, they also had beds. And so the crews would be out for days. They would fend for themselves, so they wouldn't be checking into hotels every day. They'd just stay out in the field and camp out and be out there. So the crews, they shifted to ERS, Emergency Roadside Service. And so that's what happened for the most part internally. And even though we were no longer signposting roads, the club was interested in those things and related to those things. And I know that the club has always had a kind of a permanent seat on the California Traffic Control Devices Committee, which is an advisory body that Caltrans works with, and I guess advising on things related to, so not just traffic lights, but those things that have to do with traffic control. And that got its start in 1968. But I would imagine between 57 and 68, there was some kind of informal advisory efforts on the part of the motor clubs with the state agencies that were now fully responsible for signposting the roads.
We've talked about on this podcast over a number of episodes the development of the state highway system. How involved was the Auto Club in the development of highway systems? And here I'll know, for example, in 1937, I know that the Auto Club did a traffic study, you can find it online, where they proposed a freeway system for Southern California that, although not exactly what developed, was very close to what got developed. I'm doing this from memory. There was no, for example, freeway along Sepulveda. They didn't propose the connection between the two halves of the Golden State. But other than that, it was very similar to what we eventually got. How much did Auto Club proposals for routing and improvement of highways get listened to by the state?
I do know that the traffic survey, the 1937 traffic survey of Los Angeles, was kind of a really important effort, and it was something that the club, was in our territory. The vast bulk of the club membership was drawn from the kind of greater 5-county region surrounding Los Angeles. And so, by the late 30s, as the country and as the region was kind of coming out of the worst aspects of the Depression, the club recognized that, and everybody else did too, that traffic was a real problem in Los Los Angeles. And so they undertook this survey to get a more clear picture of what was going on and to study it from a kind of historical standpoint and get a better understanding of how it evolved to the point it was in 1937, and then to come up with some proposals. And so, again, this is all focused on the region. You asked the question about statewide, and I can't really speak to that, but I do know that, as you pointed out, it's really among the first times that there's these maps of the proposed system of motorways, which was the big proposal that came out of this survey. It's the first time that you had this kind of system of motorways defined on a map looking at the greater Los Angeles area.
Now, they did this for greater Los Angeles, but the club was all of Southern California. Did they do equivalent proposals? I don't know the answer to this. For other major areas in Southern California, I'm thinking in particular maybe San Diego, the Ventura Oxnard area, maybe Santa Barbara, or parts of the Central Valley, Bakersfield. I think you even covered Fresno at the time. Did you have proposals for those cities as well?
If we did, it had to do with the club's engineering department, and they're serving as a technical resource for local jurisdictions, cities and counties in particular. I'm unaware of any kind of equivalent plan or survey of the kind of scale that the 37 LA survey did for places like San Diego. And a lot of the problems and challenges that the city of Los Angeles, the greater Los Angeles area faced were also playing out in these other municipalities. I do know that the club engineering department was providing that technical expertise to communities, smaller communities, and they would do traffic surveys and counts and studies and then make proposals about ways to address various issues, but nothing like on the scale of what you saw for LA in 37.
Northern Club do something similar. I'm wondering if they did something like a traffic study for the San Francisco or that Bay Area.
You would think that something like that was going on, though I don't have any specific knowledge of whether that was taking place.
Hey, you're the Southern Archivist. You don't know what the North is doing.
Well, sometimes it's good to kind of have that broader context, but in this case, I don't know that.
One of the services that the Audit Club provides, something that I would assume a lot of the younger folks would not even know what we're talking about in this era of online maps, was providing strip maps. And for those who aren't familiar with that, that's a service where you would go to your local Audit Club and say, I think I want to take a trip from point A to point B, and they would go back and pull little strip maps for the entire route, bind them together, and give you a book, and they would walk you through the entire route. And these are really considered very desirable by map collectors because they provided a lot of detail. How did the Audit Club get involved with doing these strip maps, especially in the early days?
Sure. The strip map, and when you bound them together, another term that some of your listeners may be familiar with called a triptych, was essentially what you were describing, where you and your family were planning a road trip going a distance. You would go into your local Auto Club branch and you would meet with a travel counselor and you'd tell them where you're going, and they'd say, well, let's just put together a group of strip maps that would show your route, and then they would use colored markers to mark and show you exactly what route you would want to take. And the triptychs would also have information about places to stay, restaurants, places of interest, things like this. And then there were places in there where you could record where you bought gas. And so a lot of times these triptychs, we have several in our collection, including some that would have specific trips. In the summer of 1963, the Jones family was going to travel from San Diego to Iowa. This is an actual example, though I don't think the family name is Jones. And so you see the route that they took, and they often, somebody, one of the parents most likely, was annotating and noting in the triptych different things. We stayed at this hotel, we stopped here, and so it became a travel log after the fact of that summer trip that the family took. So yes, the strip map, as the name kind of hints at, it really shows it's kind of longitudinal, about 11 inches by 3 inches, and it showed a segment on a route. So if you wanted strip maps from that San Diego to Iowa trip and back, you'd get a whole stack of them because you'd flip them as you would travel that segment of the road. You'd flip to the next page.
Did you special order them from the Auto Clubs in other states, or did you keep a stock of them?
Well, we had to stock ourselves. We produced, our cartography department produced them in tremendous numbers. We have a picture of our cartography folks, or probably branch folks, seated around here at headquarters building, 1928 or so. They're seated around this custom circular table that had a pintle in the middle. So what they were doing is they were assembling these packets of strip maps, because as you might imagine, a lot of the routes were fairly popular. And so our travel folks would assemble these strip maps, and then they would stick them in a little binder.
But you had them for the entire country.
For large parts of the country, though predominantly in the Southwest and in the West, which is where most of them went to, but they would also include places further east. And so those were really our very first map products. We began, not the very first, but among the first. We began providing strip maps to members about 1911.
Were the strip maps created by the Southern California Club or other auto clubs and you adopted them?
We created our own, and we also provided them to other motor clubs, but they were also being produced by other motor clubs and also by the American Automobile Association, or AAA National, of which the motor clubs were all affiliated with. And so it was a product that was provided to members throughout the country and by numerous motor clubs that also had cartography departments that would gather the information and then print them in large numbers to provide to members. But we were doing them on our own as well. The term triptych is actually a AAA National term that came into use, I think, in the mid to late 30s. We always called them strip maps, but after the triptych term came on the scene, it became very popular. It was kind of a generic reference to these sets of strip maps that were often annotated by our travel counselors.
And I know you're still involved in mapping today. When I was trying to get some coordination on this interview, I was on vacation all the way out in Palm Desert, and I stopped by the local AAA office, and people were still going there to get mapped for their location. So you're still doing it today.
That's right. I've had occasion to spend some time in branch offices, and members generally come in to conduct their DMV business, but almost as popular is folks coming in to get their free maps. So they have them in their glove box. They can spread them out on the dining room table when they're doing that trip planning. And you can also get them online. There's kind of a digital version that you can use on your phone, though it's a different experience.
As map collectors will tell you, nothing replaces a paper map.
Yes, my wife would certainly agree. I love the GPS, I love the gadgets and having the screen. But when we're traveling, she's often the navigator, and she likes to have that paper map spread out because you get the big picture.
Yep. What is the Auto Club's role today? We know they do maps, and we know that they provide insurance, and we know they provide road service. But are they still having a role in doing planning or proposing or signing or commenting on highway proposals today? Is it still got any of that role left?
Well, I think that Traffic Control Device Committee is still ongoing. Last time I checked, it was. And so, as I mentioned, we have a presence there. And then the club has always had a presence in Sacramento. We have legislative advocacy team up there that, tracks legislation that will impact potentially motorists. But as far as the kind of more focused highway and traffic issues that you guys are focused on, I think our role is much like what I've said. There may be examples, instances where we act in an advisory capacity, but it's not something that I have, exact details on. The clubs, both motor clubs in the state's been working with them for 120 plus years, and they do know that we're strong advocates for our members, and we're also a resource for all kinds of automotive related things. Safety, we have an automotive research center that provides technical expertise and does studies that relate to automotive safety, and this club is very active in that regard. So that's a little bit outside the purview of what.
And I should note, you do driver training programs. Our daughter went through an Auto Club driver training program.
That's right, and I don't know if public schools are doing driver training as much as they used to, and so there may not be as many folks who go through your high school driver training programs like you and I did when we were coming up. But you're right, we do have the driver training schools and various other public automotive safety programs that the club likes to do.
We're basically near the end of the interview, and I think as always a good closing question is, what should I have asked? So what else would you like to tell us about the Auto Club, about its role in history that I may have forgotten to ask about?
Well, Daniel, your questions were great because it did give me the opportunity to kind of showcase some aspects of club history that we're quite proud of in playing a role that is now the purview of state agencies, specifically signposting. And, we don't do that anymore, but we did early on. And so that's a service that has kind of come and gone. And so people today are not as familiar with that, understandably. And so you've given me an opportunity to kind of share that with your listeners, and I'm certainly very pleased with that. The motor clubs have, because we've played these kind of prominent roles, especially early on, has often been viewed as this kind of quasi-public agency. But, we've always been a private nonprofit. That's the model that the clubs have. And we take our role as providing service to members and the motoring public, very seriously. And so I can't really think of a question that pops into my head. You've gotten me to talk about proposed signs that were never made, which I think is kind of neat. But no, I think we've covered it. And I'm really glad that I've had the opportunity to share some Auto Club history with you folks today.
Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy day to talk to us.
My pleasure.
I found that to be a really interesting interview. And now let's return to our discussion of the history. In 1935, the legislative routes were finally created. Previously, although the routes had Division of Highways route numbers, those were maintained by the Division of Highways and never made public. In 1935, the legislature established the Street and Highways Code. This defined a whole batch of stuff, all the rules on county roads and funding and stuff like that. But it also provided a legislative definition for every state highway. It codified the Division of Highways list and numbers. It repealed all of the previous state highway statutes, and generally, not all of them, incorporated them into the new system. And the total number of highways when they did this was 206.
Through the 1930s, there was several additional U.S. routes added to the state of California. A lot of the really prominent ones that people think of and associate with the state, U.S. Route 6, which was extended to Long Beach in 1937, which was also dual proposed to go over Tioga Pass to San Francisco, but we'll get into that in the U.S. 6 episode. U.S. Route 395 in 1934, U.S. 466 in 1933, which coincidentally was also the first U.S. route over the Hoover Dam. U.S. Route 399.
I was going to say, we should note, U.S. 395 is 1934, and briefly, that entire route was signed as, or planned to be, Route 7 all the way up the Eastern Sierras.
That's correct. It's just interesting. The first Route 7 is probably the most truncated state highway I think there's been in the entire history of the state highway system. It's gone through 2 additional iterations since the original, but that corridor has had a lot of significance. You had US 395, part of US 6, and eventually the San Diego Freeway and Interstate 405 was all part of that corridor.
And then later the number was reused for the Long Beach Freeway, and at least as of when we're recording this, they just relinquished the northern stub of what was the Long Beach Freeway in Pasadena. But there are some interesting problems with that relinquishment.
US 399 was added in 1934. This is the Maricopa Highway, one of my favorite segments of the state highway system. Good plug for a good road if you want a decent drive. US 60 in 1931. US 70 in 1934, US Route 299 in 1934 over what was much of California State Route 44, the original variant, US 95 in 1938, and US 97, which was a realignment out of Oregon in 1934.
1936 and 1937 also saw the creation of some of the more famous bridges in California. There was an episode of the documentary Engineering Marvels that went into this battle between these two bridges. In 1936, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge opened, which won the battle of getting done first. That was part of the state highway system. In 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge opened. That is not part of the highway system. The highway system goes up to either end of the bridge, but the bridge itself is a separate district and not maintained by the state.
What's interesting, though, even though it wasn't state maintained, traditionally in the past, and I don't think it really is now from what I recall, it was co-signed as Route 1 in US 101.
Also in 1937, since Tom mentioned Route 1, Route 1 was completed, or I would say the bulk of it was completed. I keep trying to remember. I think it was completed through Malibu by 37, but that may have even gone later. And I don't know exactly when they made it all the way through Big Sur and some of the areas up in the Lost Coast.
Yeah, they never made it through the Lost Coast. There was always an interim route that went inland to Leggett, and it became official-ish in the 1950s. Within San Francisco, it really wasn't finished through most of the 1940s, but there was a through route that was signed through downtown. One's got a really interesting history because a lot of it wasn't really truly continuous as a state-owned highway for a very long time.
Our second season is going to go through Route 1. I think 10 out of the 12 episodes we've got mapped out cover Route 1, and then we have 2 on Route 2. So Route 1 will get broken. I happen to love the portion of Route 1 out in Malibu, which has a really interesting battle behind it.
1939 sees the passage of the Freeway Law, or the Breed Bill. This allowed construction of highways which adjacent property owners do not have rights to access. So basically, we would call this a limited access highway, or as what we would know today as a freeway. Gave the state broad powers of land acquisition for freeway construction. So we would know this as eminent domain. If you've ever heard the term eminent domain, this is where it would originate in as far as California. Required the state to reach agreement with local governments before streets could be closed for construction of a freeway. Clause gives cities and counties considerable leverage regarding freeway design and location. Within 2 weeks of passage, the California Highway Commission approved the first group of freeway declarations involving 34 miles of highways. Among these was the Arroyo Seco Parkway, for which construction had started in 1936.
1939 also saw the completion of a statewide highway planning survey. This focused on rural state highway system. It inventoried the system, because you've got to know what you have, and presented traffic data to justify the contention that much of the system was deficient in terms of meeting current traffic needs. It reported that 47% of the system was still not surface, in other words, dirt or gravel roads, that many of the roads were becoming worn out, and that hundreds of bridges suffered from structural deficiency.
At the federal level, FDR saw highway construction as an ideal public works program. 1938, Congress passed the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1938, which directed a feasibility study of a toll road highway system. The study concluded that a toll system was impractical, but did recommend about 27,000 miles of non-toll highway be added. World War II shelved a lot of these proposals, but specifically this one. In 1941, Roosevelt established the National Interregional Highway Committee to further refine the concept. In 1943, the committee recommended 39,000 miles of interregional highways as a system.
And at this point, we need to do a slight digression, because you're going to hear a number of terms. Some of these are more futuristic terms, but I'm going to cover them all right now. You have roughly 4 types of federal aid highways. There were federal aid primary highways, or FAP, which was the system of connected main highways selected by each state, subject to the approval of the Bureau of Public Roads, encompassing interstate roads and other important routes, serving essentially through traffic with their urban extensions. These were the important roads. Then there were the federal aid secondary, or FAS system, which was the system of the principal secondary and feeder routes. It included farm-to-market roads, rural mail and public school bus routes, local rural roads, county and township roads, lower road classes and urban extensions. These were chosen by the state highway department, subject, of course, to approval of the feds. And I'll note that these terms are actually no longer used, but you still see them. They've changed the funding act a bit. There were federal aid urban highways, which really wasn't a separate system, but was sort of a subset of the roads that were in urban areas. And then there were, of course, federal aid interstates, which were created in 1956, and we'll cover in a future episode. These different types of roads were used to govern how federal allocations worked under the old system. They were typically done in what were called ABC allocations. So you had 45% of the federal funding for projects on the federal aid primary system, 30% for the federal aid secondary system, and 25% for projects on extensions of these systems within urban areas. And the primary funds could either be spent on rural or urban segments of the primary system without regard to that 25% set aside. And all of these funds had to be matched by the state on a 50-50 basis. Now, where you see this A good example of these hidden numbers being important is you'll hear talk, for example, about Interstate 305 in Sacramento. Well, it's not signed as 305. It's signed as US 50. The only way we know it is interstate is it is actually on the books as FAI, Federal Aid Interstate 305. And there are a number of other roads in the state that are FAS, Federal Aid Secondary Roads, that actually aren't signed but were still built with federal aid. Were you aware of all the differences in the federal aid system?
I was, in maybe something, I don't know, the signage, that's valuable. You can never get a hold of it, especially the FAP signage. Like if you're in sign collecting, people really love that. FAS, not as much, but usually that stuff's embossed. Kind of a digression into signage collecting, but like it's rare to find them, but sometimes people find them in the strangest places that they wouldn't expect.
Did they sign them as FAP or FAS roads?
They did. I think it was more like kind of like a system of like how modern post miles would be, except the signage would obviously be steel based instead of aluminum like it is today.
Okay, and so they would sign them just to show who funded that segment of road.
Yes. 1941, this is the era of American involvement in World War II, which really even started before December 7th. So the Defense Highway Act of 1941 was passed by Congress, defined a strategic highway network, gave the highest priority for highway construction to the defense highway system as approved by the Secretary of War. Approximately $1 million was approved for the California defense highways. Construction was limited to plant access roads, defense highways, and projects deemed essential to the defense effort.
Is this when they started some of the work on the Terminal Island Freeway that was funded by the feds?
It is. It is, because you had a big naval station there on Terminal Island at the time, so that was a very, very high priority for this whole system. There's a lot of roads like around Monterey, too, that I'm pretty familiar with, because you had the Presidio and Fort Ord out there, where it was similar. They got a lot of defense highway system funding during World War II. So a good example would be this would provide for flight strips next to federal aid highways. Kind of familiar with that from Hawaii, oddly, more so than California. Like there was a lot of landing strips that were built adjacent to state highways out there. This led to the rumor that the interstate highway system has to have straight segments for landings, which totally isn't true, but it's an urban myth that's just perpetuated over time. Provided for extension of the federal aid and secondary systems.
During the war, gasoline rationing resulted in up to 50% decline in the gas tax revenues. Also during this time, a rural highway needs survey was completed. This indicated that the state highway system was underfinanced. 65% of the mileage did not meet current design standards, and projected traffic increases were expected to result in an additional 800 miles of road being classified as inadequate by 1950. It was estimated that it would take upwards of $443 million to bring the rural system up to current standards.
All right, with World War II, we've reached a good stopping point. Next time on California Highways Route by Route, we'll explore what happens as we come out of the war into the post-war era. Roosevelt and Eisenhower doubled down on highways with 1944 and 1956 acts. The Collier-Burns Act was passed, dramatically increasing highway funding. Major additions to the highway system in anticipation of freeways. The statewide freeway and expressway system is created, and freeway construction era starts.
I'd say that during the 1950s, which we'll talk about in the next episode, we saw a bulk of the expressways being built and a good start being made on the freeway system. Would you say that's fair?
I would say that's a fair assessment. This is really probably where people would recognize something that would equate to modern popping up as far as standards, designs on expressways and freeways. A lot of it came from this era that we're going to talk about in the next episode.
For more information, visit the chronology section over on cahighways.org. We'll have a link to it on our show page. Most of the Gribble Nation blogs on California touch upon these early days very heavily, in fact, including the development of the U.S. highway system. Tom has done a lot of research into the archives of the group that assigned the numbers to go into the whole history of how each route worked through the U.S. highway system and worked through its number. There is a wonderful link on the Federal Urban Highway Program that I'll have on the page, and we'll have some other additional links on the show pages. As always, details for specific routes we mentioned are on the route pages on cahighways.org and on gribblenation.org.
As always, information on the episode is available on our website, caroutebyroute.org, where you can leave us a comment on the episode. This episode is also available on our Anchor FM home, anchor.fm/CA Route by Route. Join us as we continue to explore California highways route by route.
This episode was written by Daniel Fagan and Tom Fear, edited by Daniel Fagan. Our opening theme is I Like to Be by the Seaside by John H. Glover Kine. If you have an opening theme or you have music that you think might be good for our show and is in the public domain or you'll let us use, let me know at daniel@caroutebyroute.org. We record our episodes using freeconferencecall.com. This podcast is a product of California Highways at cahighways.org and Gribble Nation at gribblnation.org. And if you might be interested in being a supporter of the podcast once we have that established, please contact Daniel at caroutebyroute.org.